Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello and welcome to episode 133 of the Monday Night Review. I do hope you are well. I found a really good bonus of having to work in the conservatory, and that is it's sunny, but it's freaking freezing outside, but I just feel nice and warm and toasty. I'm taking the wins where I can. I also get really obsessed about stuff, and I made my husband, when we moved into this house, there was this old Belfast sink in the garden, and I made my husband dig it in as a wildlife pond. And as soon as he dug it in and we'd filled it up, I realised it's about 2 foot to the left of where I want it to be. Not from his point, just because I'd make slapdash decisions. So that's been keeping me awake last night and bothering me. However, I have a nice warm cup of coffee and I've really enjoyed researching this week's episode. I am continuing to research the big thing that I'm researching and reading a book about it, and it's just so much. There's just so much. Sometimes there's just so much. But when I'm done, I will be recommending the book I'm reading because it is very good. My husband said that somebody described it as the best work of true crime writing ever, which I disagree with. I think I'll Be Gone in the Dark, about the Golden State Killer, she's a phenomenal writer. It's just incredible writer. So I'm standing by that. What have you been reading? I want your reading recommendations. I mean, for my 40th, I can't remember if I've mentioned this, but for my 40th, I asked one of my friends who I've known since I was 19 and who now lives in Sweden if he would write me a reading list. He's a professor of English, so an obsessive reader, and I just trust his knowledge. We met working in a record store, and so we've been book geeks together ever since. He basically got me through some dodgy living decisions in my life when I was younger. So he's a very important person to me. And I thought, what I really want from him is a reading list. I want a list of all his favourites, most recommended, and he delivered. I was like, I want it printed off. I want you to send it to me. I want it, so... Not only do I have 2 massive stacks of my to-read pile in my bedroom, but I also have his reading list. But I always want more. I've got to the age, though, where reading makes me nap. So it's an ongoing battle. Bring on the better weather so I can sit outside and always be slightly too cold to fall asleep. That's the dream. Anyway, on with today's episode, which, for those of you who don't like something that's unsolved, you may find annoying. This one is an unsolved case. A favourite trope among crime writers and readers alike, I would say, is a locked room mystery. A murder is committed under circumstances that seem impossible. My favourite of these is the very clever, slightly eccentric Hercule Poirot's Christmas by Agatha Christie. The difficult, wealthy old man, Simeon Lee, is murdered in his room, which is completely locked, thus giving all possible suspects an alibi. And obviously, when it's explained at the end, it all makes sense. It's a little far-fetched, but it does all make sense. And though I guess it's not that festive, I do try and read it most Christmases. It's got enough of Hercule Poirot complaining about the temperature of the grand old house he's staying in to make it really feel Christmassy to me. But what of real-life locked room mysteries? Well, today we're going back to New York City in the 1920s, and these do make me think of escape rooms. Is there an Agatha Christie's themed escape room where you're stuck in there where you go in and there's a body? It's probably not appropriate, is it? Still, I'd be up for that. The last escape room I did, I was massively pregnant. So probably not that much help. It was mildly fun, though. So yes, we're off to New York City in the 1920s and, well, late 1920s, 1929, and we are at the business place and home of Isidore Fink, who's a Polish immigrant. He'd settled in America after World War One. In some places, I've read that he had a wife and family in Europe. He works really hard after the war, and he ends up buying his own laundry business, Fifth Avenue Laundry on 123rd. I've put ND after this. 3rd and 123rd Street, 123rd Street, New York. And this is in a classic tenement in New York, and he has a couple of rooms, one which is the business, and then he lives in the rooms at the back. On the 9th of March 1929, Fink came home to the building at around 10:15 p.m. after delivering laundry. So he lives at the back, and his shop's door opens onto the street, and he used to stay open until about midnight, I believe, and I'm guessing that's because people need to drop off and pick up their laundry, that you didn't have the ability to do lots at home in the same way. I mean, New York has its own rules, doesn't it? I mean, New York, do you have a kitchen in New York? My friends who lived in New York are like, yeah, you just don't cook. Why would you cook? So the shop's door opened onto the street. He's open to midnight, but he's incredibly cautious. Crime in the area had risen in the recent months, and I've seen a couple of places say that he was borderline paranoid about something happening. So he was really strict about who he opened his door to, but there were people coming and going. Friends would drop in to visit because obviously they'd know that he would be there and his door would be open, and not literally open, but he would be around working until at least midnight. So there were a fair amount of people about. At 10:30 that evening, so he gets home about 10:15. At 10:30, a woman who lives also in the back of the building heard what sounded like a fight. She hears screaming and the sounds of, I've seen it sounds of blows, other places have it sounds of shots. Whatever it is, it's loud enough for her to realise that there's a problem, and she calls the police. Now, when an officer arrives, they cannot get in to Isidore Fink's office, into his shop, into the laundry, and the front door is properly secured. They can't break it down, and it would turn out that there's a 7-inch iron sliding bolt keeping that door shut. The window was locked and protected with bars, and eventually the only way they can see to get in is there's a transom window above the front door which had a broken hinge and is tiny. A transom window is one of those literally door width, not very high windows, and they have to get a child to go through this window to unlock the door from the inside to let them in. It's too small for an adult to fit through. Now, inside, they find a baffling scene. Isidore Fink is dead on the floor. He's been shot 3 times. They look around. The stove is lit, which implied that he had, as expected, still been working. There's no sign of the gun. There's money and valuables on him and in the property which have not been taken. And gunshot residue on the victim showed that he had been shot at close range. So initially the police think, is this sort of an elaborate form of suicide? They look around to see if there's some sort of special contraption which could have pulled the gun away, but find nothing. They look for hidden passages, cubby holes. They take up the floorboards. They find absolutely nothing. And interestingly, they only find Fink's fingerprints on the sliding bolt of the door. So how could someone have killed Isidore Fink, escaped without leaving any trace, escaped this inescapable room, but also why was he killed? There's no motive. The money is there, or the valuables are still there. There's no reason that they can see. And this locked room mystery really captivated the public's imagination, and obviously various theories started circulating about what happened. The New York Police Department suspected that the killer had left the apartment by the transom window, which would explain why there was this broken hinge on the window. We don't know how long that hinge had been broken, if it was indeed newly broken, or if that was an old damage from previous something previously. We don't know, but they suspect that maybe that's what happened. But still, you'd have to have a very, very small, agile person that was able to get up to the transom window without leaving anything to stand on the other side. So you'd have to get up to the transom window without standing on anything. So then there was this idea that there was a secret accomplice, so there was two of them. Some people believe that it was a mob hit that was then covered up by a corrupt police department. NYPD have a long history of corruption, and so people said, this was an area with mob connections, and perhaps Fink had done something to piss them off, and it was a hit. And the police knew that it was a hit and had evidence that it was. And part of this locked room situation was just a sort of cover up so that they would never have to find anyone. Lots of people thought that perhaps someone leant through the transom window from the outside, pointing the gun, and that Fink saw it and ran up to it to push the gun out of the window, and was then shot in the wrist as he tried to push the gun away, and then into the chest, and that's how the hinge breaks. But remember, this door goes out onto the street, so you've got someone who is standing on something to lean through the transom window to shoot someone, and has to therefore assume that no one is going to see them, even though we know that Fink has had friends. I think a friend dropped around at 9:45 that evening, and Fink had a customer there, so they didn't stay to chat. So this murderer would have to just take his steppy stool and assume that no one's going to go past, lean forward and shoot Fink through the window. Also, I don't know if I saw a gun coming in through the window that I would run up and grab it. So part of me thinks, oh yeah, you could push it out the window and shut the window, but surely you would just go somewhere where they couldn't shoot you, I'd have thought. So the situation that made the most sense was that he was shot in the corridor and had time to stagger back into his room and lock himself in. But medical evidence showed that both of the shots, which I believe are on the left side of his chest, he was shot in the left wrist and then in the left side of his chest. Both of these shots were fatal shots and would cause what they said was instant death. 1929, we're not sure how much they know, but of course, if you can see where the bullets are going and everything, I guess you'd know how quick this would take for a bullet near or in or however close to the heart to take effect. We also don't, it's hard to find what's actually in the laundry room. We know it was really well searched, but is it possible that there was a culprit who hid in some laundry and then whilst the policeman went to get help? Or we know that crime scenes at the time were not very well secured and that people will have been drawn to the arrival of the police and the search, and neighbours would have come out. So it's not unlikely that if someone had been hiding at the scene, they'd have been able to sort of get out and mingle with the people that were no doubt there. But it seems very unlikely when they did such a keen search. So we have no motive. The cash register's left. The Finks have got money on him. And it's this huge, confusing, what happened? It was a modern day something from a crime novel, this closed room murder. It was just fascinating to people and upsetting for Fink, but nobody knows what happened. But then in 1942, pathologist Sir Sidney Smith, writing in the British Police Journal, recounted a case that almost defied medical belief, that he'd worked on himself and there were numerous valid witnesses. And this case involved a Scottish businessman, and he was staying at a hotel in Edinburgh one winter's evening, and he was known for his erratic habits. He didn't have set times that he came and left, and so when he didn't return one night, nobody was surprised. However, at 7:30 the next morning, he rings the doorbell to the hotel and a maid lets him in, and she noticed that he's dressed normally, he's carrying an umbrella, but he has got blood stains on his face, and she is concerned. She says, "Are you okay?" And he says, "Don't worry, he's going to go upstairs and have a wash." He then places his umbrella in the rack where it would live, hangs up his coat and goes upstairs. When he gets upstairs, he collapses. The police are called. He's rushed to hospital where, sadly, he dies 3 hours later before regaining consciousness. Now, once he is under medical attention, there is no difficulty in finding the cause of death. There's a bullet wound under his chin. The bullet itself had tracked upwards, going through the brain, causing colossal damage, and then exiting out of the front of the skull, leaving a gaping exit wound of more than 1.25 inches in diameter, suggesting a .45 caliber bullet. Sidney Smith, it was examining the body. He saw no powder tattooing marks around the wound, but he did find enough powder traces in the wound to suggest that it was a close contact gunshot, and it was, to him, it looked self-administered. But how could someone who had just shot themselves through the head, through the brain, then return to the hotel, behave normally enough to hang his coat up where it needed to be hung, put his umbrella in the rack, and have a conversation with the maid? Police track a trail of blood from the hotel to the public gardens that are opposite, and in these gardens they find a gazebo-type shelter, and lying on the seat is a .45 revolver that they would later identify as belonging to the businessman. In front of the seat, on the ground, there was a large pool of blood, and above where the pool of blood was and the seat, in the roof of the shelter, is a bullet hole. And in the bullet hole, in the roof, they find fragments of brain matter and bone. So they were happy to confirm that this was where the shooting had taken place. But they had to try and pinpoint when this had taken place, when the shooting had happened. So they knew that it had begun snowing at around 6 o'clock that morning, and we know that he arrived at the hotel at 7:30 that morning. So they also note that there's a trail of footprints and blood spots leading out from the shelter in a circle of around 165 yards and then back into the shelter, and then a single trail of blood spots from the shelter to the hotel. So they know that he had shot himself. At some point, he'd then walked out from the shelter in a circle and then gone back into the shelter and then walked from the shelter to the hotel. So they were they were able to conclude that he had shot himself at least a couple of hours before he finally died. He must have shot himself, stayed where he sat, probably from shock, and for some time, hence the pool of blood, and then gone for a walk in a circle. Probably, I mean, it must have been just completely surreal and awful, and then back to the shelter, and then maybe just, you know how you hear that people who get attacked by sharks, that one of the last things they remember is them swimming away, when in fact they haven't. They're just sort of bitten in the sea and having a horrible time, but they don't remember that at all, they think. And we did an episode on the boat sinking and people imagining that they were swimming to a new boat to safety, which didn't exist. So maybe he just didn't realise what he'd done and goes back to the hotel, and it's all rather surreal. And they know that it was self-inflicted. He had left letters that made it clear what he was planning to do. But obviously he had blown away a sizable chunk of his brain and his skull, lost a fair amount of blood, and managed to live and walk for several hours afterwards, talking coherently to the maid, as I keep saying, hanging the coat up, putting the umbrella away, and then succumbed to his injuries. Sir Sidney Smith wrote that any medical person seeing this massive injury would automatically assume a near instantaneous death. But he knew that this had not been the case. He said, quote, "It was a striking example of what can be done after a severe injury to the brain." But Fink wasn't shot in the brain. Fink was shot in the chest. Interestingly, Emily Ency Narcisco, a doctor's assistant who works in emergency medicine, said, "You could run 25 feet if shot in the chest, depending on where the bullet hit. I've seen people drive themselves to the emergency department after being shot, then simply run through the front door." So what we can go on with the story of Isidore Fink is what we know, what evidence we have, even the evidence collected in 1929. The evidence suggests that he was shot at close range, so therefore he was either shot in his room or in the hallway. Now, if he was shot in the hallway standing up, his clothes would have absorbed blood rather than there being a load of blood on the floor. So it's believed that he was shot in the hallway and then staggered backwards into his laundry, where he slammed the door and locked the bolt. Kevin McQueen, a true crime writer, told the New York Times that this theory explains, quote, "how the door's bolt was slid into place and why no fingerprints except Fink's were found at the crime scene. Only two people could possibly have slid the door's bolt, Fink or his killer, and since it was impossible for the killer to have done it, it must have been Fink." Now, this doesn't solve the case of who shot Isidore Fink, but it does solve the mystery of how he was found in a locked room that was completely inaccessible from the outside. And that is the impossible death of Isidore Fink. It's bizarre. I mean, maybe it was a robbery, an off-chance robbery that went terribly wrong, because, as you can imagine, if you shoot someone twice in the chest, you expect them to go down. So maybe that was it. It was just someone realising that it was a business that was still open. There weren't that many people around. So shoot the proprietor in the hallway, steal the cash register, job's done, but didn't bank on Fink being able to lock the door. I'd be interested to know if there were any other armed robberies around the same time that could possibly be linked. But we can just assume that these two shots to the chest that were believed to have caused instantaneous death were in fact not as instant as initially believed. I'd like to know what you think. I think that's probably the way it went. I don't think it can involve the window. I love to hear from you, so find me on social media at The Monday Night Review. You can join the Patreon, also The Monday Night Review, and you can email me, themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. You can buy me a coffee, which is very nice of you. You can buy me some merch. You can buy yourself some merch if you have a look at the link in the bio. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seats before you drive.